everyone, welcome back. Now, it's been almost exactly 4 months since I last had this bike with these forks in this exact spot. And I've had a few people wondering if I've come up with a verdict on the Trust Meshes forks yet. And yes, I have. And today I'm going to tell you exactly what I think of these forks. Now, in these 4 months I've had these forks, I've tried to punish them as much as I can. I've taken them to Switzerland twice, I've taken them to the Austrian Alps, I've taken them to the Italian Alps, as well as generally just around Scotland and doing some trial stuff on them as well. So I've not been taking it easy on these things. And I will also remind you guys that I've not been paid to run these forks. I did get given them, but I do have to give them back again. I'm going to be fully honest and open with you guys. If there's bad things about this fork, I'm going to tell you. So yeah, I'm not going to hide anything. In my last video where I did a kind of first look at these forks, I was comparing them to the motion ride linkage forks. Now, I'm not going to do much comparison in this video. I covered most things in that one. They're different forks. They do what they do in a completely different way, and they've got way different amounts of travel. I've not really ridden this bike with 130mm travel telescopic forks. Now, the bike did come with some Fox ones, but I couldn't take those forks with me to the Alps and do back-to-back comparisons. So these are just a standalone review of these forks. Pros, cons, what do I think of them? Now, I have actually made some notes, so let's get started. Okay, the first notes I made were my first impressions riding these forks. The first one I wrote down here was, it's very stiff, and that probably doesn't come as too much surprise. They are chunky forks, they are full carbon, they are stiff, there's no flex going on. The fore and aft stiffness on these forks is unlike any I've tried, even big burly downhill forks, which I've briefly been on. These forks are as stiff as anything I've ever tried. That means that any wheel movement is purely coming from the suspension, which has obviously been designed and tweaked by Trust, rather than normal forks, which will have some flex as well as the wheel movement. So I think that's a huge bonus. The only wheel movement you're going to get from these is the controlled suspension movement, no random flex at all. Now, stiffness brings me on to the next point that I wrote down here, which is confidence. Now, when you're on your bike, you're looking down, you're seeing the massive chunky fork. That can't do anything but inspire confidence. And it's funny, when I've been on a friend's bike, just in a car park or whatever, I look down at normal traditional forks, they just look so skinny. They just don't inspire the same level of confidence that these do just from the sheer looks of them. Now, other than stiffness and confidence inspiring, the other first impression that I got was these forks are a little bit tricky to set up. Now, if you're a little bit like me with traditional forks, you probably have a bit of a system in the car park where you get a rough estimate of where they need to be. You go out on the trail and you adjust it on the fly. These forks, they're not quite as easy as that. That said, they're not super hard. You just have to take things a little bit differently. Testing these forks in a car park isn't like a normal fork where you get a rough idea. They just behave so differently. Because they have a slight J shape, the wheel moves slightly backwards at the first bit of the travel. It can make the forks feel a little bit over damped in a car park, but when you take it out on the trail, they feel actually pretty damn spot on. When I first got these forks, I followed Trust's recommended setup numbers. They are your weight in pounds in PSI. So whatever weight you are, I weigh around, 160 pounds. So I put 160 PSI in both air chambers of these forks. Now, when I went out riding, I found they were far too linear, and no matter how much I adjusted them by putting in more air pressure, I was still finding I was blowing through the travel way too much. Now, I mentioned this to Trust and they were super helpful, and with the help of the UK distributors upgrade, they actually sent me a replacement damper with 3 tokens already installed. And then it was simply a case of unbolting the lowers of these forks, unbolting the damper, shoving the new one back in and going off. And I must admit, getting the old damper out and putting the new one in was super easy. All you need is a couple of Allen keys and 5 minutes, and yeah, no problem at all. Now, with the 3 air tokens fitted, I went back to the recommended pressure of my body weight in pounds in PSI, and you know what, that was actually pretty close to where I needed to be. I actually let a little bit of PSI out in the main air chamber. I dropped it down to about 145 PSI in the right-hand air chamber, and I kept the left-hand one at about 160 PSI. I combined that with about 5 clicks on the compression adjuster inside the fork leg, and I found this was a pretty good compromise. It gave me just enough suppleness to still have enough support and bottom out resistance to let me do the type of riding that I liked. The recommended sag level on these forks is 20%, and those numbers and adjustments gave me just under that. And I was really happy with that. Behavior of the fork was pretty much exactly what I was after. After spending a while trying to set these forks up, I'm pretty happy with the numbers I came to, and the actual suspension action of these forks has really impressed me. Now don't forget, these are 130mm travel forks. I've actually never had forks with as little travel as this. So when I found out I was going to go to the Alps, I was a little bit worried I was going to be under forked. Now I had no reason to be concerned. I have actually been I've been blown away by these forks. Now I'm not going to beat around the bush here. These forks have actually impressed me so much. There wasn't any terrain that I felt these forks wasn't good on. From the downhill trails with the big impacts, the backwards axle path seems to soak up the bumps really well, to the natural trails with all the small pebbles, fist-sized rocks. Again, it soaked up all that kind of stuff. And even bike parks and flow trails, the over-damped feel that you got in the car park came to its own on those where you want a bit of a firmer suspension feel so you can lift the bike off lips and just generally do jumps and tricks. And I've just generally never felt a fork that felt good in all these situations. Normally, if you're riding a flow trail or a bike park, you want to put some more air or a stiffer spring in your forks even, whereas no, these seem to cope with everything with no extra adjustments. And that's pretty hard to make a fork that can handle all of these terrains with no extra adjustments needed. And it's not only the ability to absorb hits and bumps with the backwards axle path, it also means that the faster you go, the more stable it feels. Now I followed some really fast riders and I don't know how hard they were pushing it, but I was really pleased to be able to keep up with them. They had the full-on enduro bikes with the 160mm travel, and they seemed to be going fast, and I managed to keep up with them, and I'm really impressed with that for a 130mm travel bike and fork. Before I got these forks, one of the concerns I had was with the backwards axle path. I thought that the shortening wheelbase and potentially steepening head angle would make the bike feel pretty nervous when you bottom out the fork or going down steep terrain. Actually, I didn't notice any nervousness at all, and I find it really interesting how these forks have gone completely the opposite direction of the motion forks, who try to keep your wheelbase longer and your head angle slacker. They've both managed to make a fork that feels super stable. It's just that Trust have done it by making the trail bigger, which I've never really considered trail numbers, but a lot of fork manufacturers these days are reducing the amount of offset on the forks to increase the trail to make the bike more stable. And effectively, Trust are doing that kind of on the fly as you're riding. The more travel you use, the bigger the trail gets, the more stable the bike gets, and you know what? It does work. The other thing I noticed, and this is way more subtle, it wasn't a night and day thing, was cornering. I do feel that these forks were slightly better when you're cornering than a telescopic fork. Now, like I've mentioned, I've not compared these with 130mm travel traditional telescopic forks, so I can't directly compare, but I have been using telescopic forks on my longer travel bike, and I definitely feel that these are a little bit more stable when cornering. So again, it's very subtle, but I do think it's there. It's like riding a steel hardtail compared with an aluminium one. There is something about it. Now, by far the biggest surprise I got with these forks was something that people have mentioned in my POV videos I've been doing recently. I haven't been talking about arm pump. That's because I haven't really been getting arm pump, and that is a huge surprise. Like I've mentioned, these are 130mm travel forks. I've been taking them to the Alps, which are the biggest mountains I've ever ridden, the longest trails I've ever ridden, some of the roughest trails I've ever ridden. Now, there was a couple of times where I did get arm pump, but it was so much reduced. And like I mentioned, 130mm travel forks on alpine terrain. I used to get arm pump riding normal forks on some of the Scottish trails around here, which are mellow compared to those, so I can't believe it. And that alone, to me, is one of the biggest pluses of these forks. I did notice much reduced arm pump. Now, there may be some other variables about this as well. I've been using some brakes I've not used before, never used these tyres, so maybe there are some different things there that are playing a part of it, but on the whole, I think the forks had the biggest part. Now, one of the other concerns I had when I got these forks was the carbon steerer tube. Now, normally carbon steerer tubes are saved for the most exotic of lightweight XC forks, and I'm a bit scared of them. It seems my fears were unfounded. I've punished these forks. I've ridden terrain which they probably weren't designed for. I've crashed them. I've done jumps and landed on upslopes on them. I've hit rocks I shouldn't have hit. They've not creaked, they've not groaned, they've not done anything they shouldn't have. The carbon steel tube has proven to be super strong, and yeah, I should not have been scared of them. They are built to last. The one thing I haven't punished these forks with is much wet weather. I've actually been away in Europe quite a bit where the weather's actually been really kind to me, mainly dust. And yeah, that means I haven't really pushed the bearings of these forks to the limits. That being said, they're still perfect, they're smooth, the forks are still super sensitive. The bearings do have a lifetime warranty, I believe, and I'm confident that they'll last a lot longer without maintenance than a traditional pair of forks. It's not all good news though. As nice as these forks are, there were some things I think could be improved. Now, in no particular order, and this first one's a bit of a nitpick. I've not really noticed it out riding how the forks are meant to be ridden, but when I've been doing some trials in jibbing stuff, I have noticed that the lower links have had a bit of a twist to them. Now, these forks are effectively upside down forks. They don't have a bridge connecting the lowers like a normal fork would. So that means the axle is the only thing that's holding the lowers of these forks together. And when doing some trials moves, some jibbing stuff where I've been twisting the forks probably more than you would when out riding a trail, I have noticed the wheel twisting within the fork legs. But like I said, that is a nitpick. The one thing I think that could improve that would maybe be a bigger axle, a 20mm axle perhaps, or even an 8mm Allen key so you can tighten up this one a little bit more. Now, I did speak to Trust about this and they did make some good points. At the minute, the fork needs a 6mm Allen key to tighten the axle, and they chose that because most multi-tools have a 6mm Allen key. If you add an 8mm Allen key there, then a lot of multi-tools will struggle to actually fit in there to tighten up your fork. And if you go for a 20mm axle and bolt up, you're just making it really inconvenient to take the wheel in and out. That being said, I still think making the axle setup a little bit stiffer would probably improve these forks just a little bit more. And since we're talking about the axle, because the lower links of these forks are so chunky, it is actually quite tricky to get an Allen key to fit there without rubbing against the fork leg or just generally getting enough leverage on it. I've tried a few multi-tools and they do fit, but it is tricky. I do feel like I can't tighten the axle as much as I'd like with a multi-tool. I have to use a longer Allen key from a professional toolkit to tighten this axle as much as I'd like. And continuing talking about the axle, for some reason the axle actually is made for two pieces. There's the main axle that goes all the way through, and then there's a cap on the end where the Allen key fitting is, which screws in. Now, when I first got these forks and I tried to tighten up my axle, the end cap just unscrewed when I got to a certain point, which meant that I could not tighten my axle anywhere near enough to ride the bike. Now, I don't know whether that was a pre-production thing, I don't know whether it meant to have Loctite on it. Either way, I had to glue it back together, and it's been fine ever since, but I still don't see why it's a two-piece system, and it definitely should have had Loctite on it. So that's one to look out for if you do get a pair of these forks. Now, there was one major thing that went wrong with these forks throughout the weeks and months I've been riding them, and that is I have actually lost air pressure from the main air chamber. Now, this could be user error. I must admit, I lost the dust caps for these forks. Now, I've never known losing dust caps to mean air loss, but you never know. The other thing I did was when I was out on the trail to try and reduce a bit of air pressure when I was experimenting with setup, I used a little rock. And it's possible I damaged it. Maybe there's a bit of grit that's got stuck in there. I can't see any, but I can't rule out that it's user error that's meant it's lost air rather than a defect. That being said, the air loss isn't fast. Over a week spent in Austria, Switzerland and Italy, it did lose air almost completely over that week. It wasn't just one big loss. Now, I pumped it up and continued riding and it was great. I then came back, left the bike for just over a week, came back to it and the air would come out again. So that's not ideal. This is something I will mention to Trust and I will update the description when they respond to that. The other comment I'll have on the air loss is when these forks do lose air, they're still rideable. Now, Trust do not recommend riding these forks with no air pressure in them. I don't think anyone would recommend that, but they were still quite rideable. But like I said, it wasn't an immediate thing. I could still ride the bike. I just got to the bottom of the hill, pop more air in it, good to go. Now, the other thing I don't like about these forks are the hose guides. The issue I've had is with the plastic clips that Trust supply that clip into those carbon guides that then hold the hose in. Now, they actually do their job really, really well. They hold the hose absolutely perfectly, out of the way, doesn't go anywhere near the wheel. The issue I had was when I tried to take these forks off for other video work, I could not get these plastic clips out. I tried everything. I tried going in from the back to see if there was a little clip you had to press. I tried brute force, and in the end, they just got really, really damaged, and I actually lost a little bit of blood in the meantime. I think there's room to improve with the hose guides. Okay, to make this a little bit more visual, I'm going to put the good points there and the bad points there. So the good points, they're stiff, nice suspension action, obviously, especially at speed. They're stable, good front tire grip, strong, adjustable, confidence inspiring, good for jibbing, no stanchions to scratch, and lifetime bearing warranty. Now the bad points, tricky setup. They are pretty heavy, about 2 kilos. Marmite looks, you either love them or hate them. I actually think they look fairly decent on this bike, but I must admit on other bikes I've not been so keen. Fiddly hose guides, like I just mentioned, non-user serviceable at the minute anyway. I'm hoping in the future you can add the air tokens yourself, but like I mentioned at the start of the video, I had to actually send away the damper and get a whole new damper sent to me to get the tokens installed, so that's not ideal. There's the axle issues I had, the air chamber leak issue, and the price. They're still really expensive forks. Okay, time for my final verdicts. Now I must admit, despite some of these issues I've had, I actually really enjoyed my time riding these forks. Like I mentioned, the arm pump stuff, I've actually been blown away by them. They felt equally at home doing trialsy jib stuff on this exact log as they have been going down World Cup downhill tracks and natural trails, flow trails, bike park stuff. They've handled everything, and like I've mentioned, for a 130mm travel fork, that's pretty insane. And also, despite riding some of the longest trails and some of the roughest trails, I never noticed any decline of suspension action other than that one time with the air leak. I haven't noticed any change of performance due to altitude, heat, repeated hits, and one of the days we were riding it was 40 degrees. But there's no beating around the bush. They are still expensive, they are still heavy, they're still Marmite looks. Can I recommend them? Yeah, well, maybe. Like I mentioned earlier, I've not ridden another 130mm travel fork to compare these against. In an ideal world, I would go and ride exactly the same trails I've ridden for the last few months on a set of, say, Fox or RockShox forks, so I can compare them. But that's totally impractical. So as a result, don't take my word as gospel on these forks. Trust are doing a really good job of fitting these forks to as many test bikes as they can at as many different events as they can. So I'd really recommend you go and find somewhere that has a test pair of forks and go and test them out and decide for yourselves. I think personally I could justify the high price for the arm pump and the fact they can handle everything. Overall, I've really enjoyed riding them. I do think I was faster for having these forks. Like I mentioned, I managed to keep up with some riders I would not have been able to keep up with previously. I don't think so anyway, so I do think they made me faster. If I was in the market to buy some forks in the near future, I would have these pretty high up my list of possibilities. Right, that is all my notes. I've probably missed some stuff, but I hope this review was helpful if you were considering these forks. You may have seen Trust have a longer travel version of these called the Shout, and one thing I actually mentioned to Trust before I had any knowledge of those forks is that if they made a longer travel fork, I think it could be a real game changer. Now they seem keen to send me a set to try. I'm trying to see if I can maybe get a bit of a nicer enduro bike to actually do them justice, so look out for that in the future. I can't guarantee I will get some, but I would certainly like to try them out. If these forks coped with alpine terrain and got rid of most of my arm pump, I can't imagine what a 178mm travel version would be like. I think they would actually be unreal, so I'd love to try some. So yeah, hope you have an absolutely brilliant week. Get out, ride your bikes, and also buy my merch. Now it doesn't normally come with mud spatters. I've been out getting an extra angle filming with this fork, but yeah, buy my merch. It'll be a lot cleaner than this, and I'll catch you next time. So see you later everyone, bye bye. Okay, so I actually sent a copy of that video to Trust just to get their version of some of the issues I've had, and they were real quick to reply and they made some pretty good points. Now the point I made about losing air pressure, that was probably the biggest issue I had. Their response was that the air caps are pretty vital. They actually have a 4mm Allen key on them, specifically to make sure that you actually have them up tight enough. they have a rubber seal and do actually help keep air pressure in. They also do not recommend using rocks to let air out, and yeah, I don't recommend that either. I was just out testing them, it was the only thing I had to hand, so yeah, definitely don't do that. So as I suspected, probably the most likely reason why they lost air was user error. I've certainly never heard any other reviewers say that they've lost air pressure in their forks, so I'm willing to accept that that's my fault. The second point was to do with the air pressure in both air chambers. Now this is probably my fault again for not reading the manual properly or not understanding it, despite Trust doing a really good job of trying to make it as simple as possible. They do recommend keeping the air pressures the same PSI on both sides of the leg, not mixing and matching like I did. Now with the hose guide issues I had, I actually got it on the screen here, they recommend using a 4mm Allen key to push upwards from the bottom. It's something blunt enough not to puncture the hose. They should pop up without any issue. So I'm definitely going to have to try that next time. Now the other major issue I had with the forks was to do with the axle and unscrewing, and apparently that is a bit of a safety feature that the forks have built in. The end cap is there so you don't over tighten the axle and potentially damage the forks. Now I didn't see any of that in the user manual, so I just assumed it needed Loctite on it and it was something missed from the factory, whereas yeah, I should have used a Torx wrench and actually done it up to the 17 Newton meters they recommend. Now unfortunately I didn't have a Torx wrench. I did actually order one, but it got lost in the post and I still don't have one, so I had to go by feel. And I was just a bit concerned that the tightness of the axle when it did unscrew just wasn't tight enough, so I glued it. They definitely do not recommend doing that, and I don't recommend doing that, so please don't try and glue your axle together. The last point that they made was the cost, the value of the forks, and you know, this is an opinion thing. What's a good value to one person is not a good value to another person, so this is completely opinionated. But like Trust have said in their email to me, they stand by the cost of their product. And they also say by comparison, the average cost of a carbon mountain bike wheel set is more than $2,000, and they reckon you'll get a bigger performance advantage from running these forks than spending that much money on carbon wheels. So yeah, some good points, take from that what you will. But it seems other than clearing up some of these issues I've had, they enjoyed the video. They liked how I mentioned that the forks get better the faster and harder you push them. So yeah, I'm glad they appreciate it, and they seem pretty keen to send me some shout forks. So should be pretty fun, pretty interesting. I've certainly got some ideas of stuff I want to try and those. So once again, thanks for watching. I hope these messages from Trust cleared things up a little bit, and yeah, let me know what you think. So see you later everyone, bye bye.